Technology can't fix what leadership won't acknowledge. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most workplace solutions are designed to make companies feel better and not actually solve the problems. I'm Kim Bohr, host of Courage to Advance, and my guest today is Callie Bakken. She spent years implementing HR technology and experiencing firsthand what happens when a company's stated values and leadership behavior exist in completely different universes. That disconnect and the toxic culture it created became her breaking point, but it also became her catalyst. Callie is currently the interim executive director of Matthew's Voice Project and simultaneously the founder of WiggleWork, a company mobilizing workplace childcare as a strategic solution. Callie's journey is one many can relate to, and I'm really excited to dig in. Callie, welcome to Courage to Advance.
I am so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for our conversation. So one of the things that stood out to me as we've gotten to know each other is that you've experienced trust, or really, the lack of it, from almost every angle. And you've led through disruption, you've survived toxic culture, and now you're building something that's really about meeting people's fundamental needs. And we're going to talk a lot about that. It seems like you've learned that trust isn't built when everything's going well, but it's really forged in how organizations handle that hard stuff. And that's what I want to dive into with you today with our listeners.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about it. One of the things that I've been saying for the last 15 years probably is oftentimes people know too much to feel comfortable, but not enough to feel comfortable. And I think that's one of the fundamental mistakes that we see in leadership a lot is we're trying to protect people from things that we think will show them instability or that we don't have everything under control. When in reality, people have an idea that things are happening, and the lack of willingness to address it causes more harm than we think it does by trying to keep things under wraps.
I cannot agree with you more. Absolutely. So let's talk about a bit of where you're at right now. So you'd been on the board of Matthew's Voice, which I want you to explain to people what that is, since 2022. You recently became the first employee as the executive director. And it's in part the organization partners exclusively with social workers to support students experiencing homelessness. And that's just at its nature inherently crisis-driven work. What is leading in that constant state of urgency taught you about organizational resilience and really help people understand really foundationally what is Matthew's Voice? Just kind of give a little bit more context around it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it started as a grassroots effort to specifically help students experiencing homelessness feel seen and have their needs met within the schools so that they maintain those connections, specifically with social workers, to help keep them engaged in the school system so that they have the highest likelihood of reaching graduation, which we know is going to be one of the biggest opportunities for breaking the cycle of poverty. It's really funny because I was asked to be on the board by a friend of mine who is on the board, and I had expected to go to the conversation learning more, turning something down for the first time ever, saying, I just have too much stuff going on right now to say yes to this. And the more we started talking about it, the more it was clear that that wasn't an option. And so I, just like most of the people on the board, were working, 50, 60 hours a week on average, and adding that in because it's such an incredibly important mission in a community where people really don't want to talk about homelessness. That's something that happens elsewhere. It doesn't happen here where we take care of one another. And so that's been really, really eye-opening to see what that looks like. As far as the urgency piece of things, we're the last ones that people call on. So basically our mission is to jump in where no one else is. And so we're constantly reevaluating and evolving based on what needs are being met within the community and what needs are not being met. And so by the very nature of that, we are constantly having to reassess what are we doing, where are we adding value, and how do we meet those needs as they arise. And so it's really challenging, especially as a part-time employee, to be having such urgent needs happening. But we do have an incredible team that will help when I need others to jump in and that sort of thing too, from the board perspective. But really, from a leadership standpoint, I think constantly checking back in with the mission and what we're here to do is so important, because what we're doing today might be different than what we're doing tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And as long as we have that core ability to see help those students be seen and feel seen, I think there's a lot of different ways that our work can evolve and impact the community, especially when we deal with such challenging times like right now, with resources being limited and typical funding streams changing and all of the uncertainty within the nonprofit world.
It is really incredible right now. And I know, you and I talked a little bit about this prior. Matthew's Voice serves as a really specific population in such a unique way. You work through social workers rather than directly with students, much for that confidentiality purpose. And that creates a really interesting challenge. How do you create meaningful experiences for donors and volunteers when they can't directly see that impact? And really, what have you learned about building the trust when people can't see that full picture?
Yeah, that is probably the biggest challenge that we face as an organization. We have specifically made a name for ourselves for supporting unaccompanied students, so those who don't have a parent or guardian in the picture. That's not always, but typically a high school student. So they're not cute and snuggly anymore necessarily. And so it's a population that's often overlooked because we make assumptions about them and how they got to the place that they're at, versus understanding that no situation is identical to another, right? They're all super unique. And so one of the things that we've started doing as an organization is trying to just create fun community activities where we bring people together around something related to the work that we do. And we take that opportunity to have community building activities where we're able to share information about the work that we do without necessarily having direct work that impacts our mission, if that makes sense. And so trying to softly give people an opportunity to learn without having them feel vulnerable the way that talking about homelessness can, but also being very specific in who that population is that we serve. There's a federal act called the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Act, and that's federal guidelines around how schools support student homelessness. And so we support students who fall under that umbrella specifically. And so that's able to provide trust for our donors that it is truly the students they anticipate supporting that are being supported by their funds. And having that very specific focus does help, especially when we have such unique challenges that we support that could be, one-off. So an example, we paid for braces for a student who'd been kicked out of their house, and trying to support themselves while paying for such an expensive process. That's something we've done once, and we're able to really lighten that student's load and show her that the community cares about her, keep her in school rather than working more hours than she could handle on top of school. And so being able to share stories like that, of course, are important in giving examples, but primarily I think that narrow focus is how we're able to keep the community's trust with such a confidential mission.
I like that example. I think that helps shape the type of work. So before you said yes, you actually turned down the executive director role multiple times. What changed? What got to you to make you finally realize you were ready to take it on?
Yeah, so being able to come on in an interim capacity, not at full time, was really the combination of things with where the organization is at and having that first employee in place. Coming in at full time at what the organization could afford doesn't make sense for my skill set and wasn't what I was looking for originally. Coming from the startup world and the nonprofit world before that, I really wanted something that was stable, had good benefits so that I could have a baby and then figure out what was next when I got through that toddler stage. And what became more and more apparent was the type of work that suits me, that was available within my community, was not the kind of thing that would keep my interest. And so after a little while of kind of job hunting, trying to find the perfect next step, I started to come to the conclusion that there wasn't going to be a magic position that made me happy. I had to build it myself. And so I started work on creating my own company. And that's really what made accepting an interim part-time role possible, is being able to have that foundation that was able to provide some income back to my family while also giving me the time and flexibility to focus on my own work as well. The challenges of trying to really build a nonprofit and a startup at the same time is unique, but it's been a lot of fun and really incredible. I'm very grateful that I've had the opportunity to take both that bet on myself and be able to bring the organization to that next level.
So that leads us into really talking about the childcare consulting business you're building. You've described to me before in this kind of hurry up and pause, wait type of mode. How do you think about progress and momentum when nothing is moving quite as quickly as you'd like it to?
I think we have to maintain a constant vigilance around response to where we're at right now, whether that's personally or what's happening in the world. I think especially with what's happening in the world right now, nothing really is as it seems. And so not being so set on looking at, this is the plan and I'm driving forward, but really taking a step in that plan and then seeing what still makes sense and what needs to evolve has been really critical in that process. And so looking back now, a year and a half after saying yes to the executive director role and really kind of jumping in on all of this, I'm at a very different spot than I was originally hoping to be at this point. But I have such a strong foundation in connections that I've built along the way, especially within the childcare space, as we'll talk more about. But I know so many things that I couldn't have learned from just, reading a book or going online and doing research. And so I'm really trying to savor all of the extra pieces that will help me be better at the work that I do, because I've been open to finding new avenues to make connections and build a world around that business versus just saying, here's my business plan and this is what I'm sticking to.
That ability to have the patience and the ability to evaluate is so critical with what you're describing, because that's often very challenging for people that are trying to start something that they're so passionate about, and really recognizing that timing is so critical. That says a lot about how you're really thinking about what you're doing with such intention. So before Matthew's Voice, and before we talk about what brought you into the childcare place, you had some significant experiences that I want you to speak to, because I think it's so clearly how it shaped this importance around the childcare work you're doing and you're working towards now. So you had spent years working in HR tech, first implementing what you had described as some of the more HCM systems, benefits administration, and then moving towards a startup that was focused on employee engagement and culture. So what drew you to that work initially, and what did you think the technology would be able to solve?
My favorite HR people are the people who sort of fell into it and said, how did I get here? And that's really my story too. And so I started with a nonprofit organization expecting that I was kind of figuring out which direction of grad school I was going to be taking from that experience. And I fell into the business office and found that that was really a place that I like to be. I really like the strategy side of things, and getting things right from a people perspective is so important to me. And so I fell into HR. What happened though was that I saw such a different reality in how HR was functioning in the community and in my area versus what I saw HR could be and the strategy lens that I wanted to take. And so I had gone through a lot of HR tech implementations and found out that there's a lot of people who have absolutely no idea what HR does, who are trying to set up systems for that work. I got really excited about being a hole filler. I guess that's how I would describe most of my career is something needs to be done. We don't know who's going to do it. It's probably me. In that process, I just saw that, having someone who understood HR work and being able to know the frustrations of going through implementations, both from an internal perspective and working with that provider, that I really felt equipped to be able to make the experience better. And so that was really the point of thinking about that transition was I'm not suited for HR in the place that I am and needing to stay in this area, but feeling like I could add a lot of value in helping to bring people to the place that I wanted HR to be and giving them the resources to be able to focus on the people rather than on all of the systems and processes. And that's really what brought me to HR Tech. What's interesting is the employee engagement and culture space technology company was really a spinoff of the HCM system. And really the concept of being able to take data to create better places to work by understanding employees more effectively and helping to drive change at meaningful points in that employee's personal life was really the magic bullet for me in saying yes to joining that original company, because I wasn't quite sure how all of that would work together, but I was really excited to see how the founder of that company was going to make that happen.
So you spent several years there, a considerable amount of time actually, and then something shifted. So what started to crack in that belief that the technology could really start to influence some of these fundamental workplace challenges that you were really identifying?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to watch the evolution of HR perspective. And since I joined, I would say the more broad HR support community, because there was originally a heavy demonization of data. And we can't be people focused if we're driving decision making from a data perspective. And I really fought against that, saying, data is such a critical piece in gaining leadership buy-in and being able to know that you're on the right track. We have to be able to do both. And so that was what really drew me to HR Tech from an industry development standpoint. What changed was understanding that just because we have the information doesn't mean that we know what to do with it. And that so few companies are at a point in time where they're willing to really operationalize the conclusions that the data is drawing. And so working from a support capacity with companies on the data strategy piece was incredibly frustrating because a lot of people just weren't ready to create strong culture strategy. And that was a really ambiguous and scary thing for them. And so it just started kind of crumbling the idea that data was going to alone create a solution. The other thing that was happening at that point in time, especially when we think about the COVID response era, we had a huge tendency to put things in place like Calm or other apps that really were an easy button, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And now, being several years past that, we've got a ton of data that shows that just putting something in place alone isn't going to create results or meaningful results. And so it doesn't matter how great the tech is, if it adds burden to the employee's experience and the work that they need to do, they're not going to use it. And so the more that we can focus on what are the true needs that we know are causing strain and pressure, and how do we alleviate those challenges, that's really what brought me to more of an analog approach, I would say, that we need to stop thinking that technology alone is going to create solutions.
Yeah.
We have to just use it as a stepping stone in driving a larger strategy focused more on human experience.
Let's talk a little bit about that kind of culture piece. You've described that startup environment as having very intense competition, some volatility to it. For people who haven't perhaps experienced that kind of culture firsthand. What does that look like day to day? And how did it really affect how you started to show up to the work when you had found that mission-driven purpose? And it sounded like there was some real disconnect emerging.
Yeah, I originally felt like there was a lot of synergy between the nonprofit space and the startup space in the scrappiness, right? You have a lot of, okay, we need something to exist, but we don't have a lot of resources. Let's pull it out of thin air. And that was really exciting to me. And I think that's the biggest thing that I gained from that experience was a comfort with creating scrappy solutions and testing to see, did that work? Do we need to readjust? What was really unique about the work that I was specifically doing in that environment is I was the one who was creating the guess and test and then move on processes. Well, most of the other people were working in much more concrete terms than I was. When you have a really small team that's doing a lot of work under a lot of pressure and financial pressure to produce results that are going to make the board and investors happy, it really created a divide between what I was working on and how I was trying to support the company and what others were also working on. And so I think it's easier to talk about now from a lens of, what went wrong and why was it such a hard place to be? And I think that that's the crux of it was really that it was hard for other people to understand more of the marketing and outreach and more of the strategic building work that I was doing because they wanted to see immediate results, and that just doesn't happen. But I think there was also a lot of disdain for me specifically because I was the one who was out doing the fun stuff while other people were doing the real gritty, boring things. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about that is a lot of the stress from my work specifically came from, I was always having to come up with new ideas and try to get results from them and build something out of nothing versus more of that concrete, I would say, safety net that everyone else had. One of the things I started saying more to my friends at the end was, I'm on everyone else's team, but no one's on my team. And so I think because of doing more of the unique visual work for, from a marketing lens or coming in to provide more unique strategies with more creative problem solving, people really didn't know what to do with me in the same way that they knew how to relate with one another. Mm-hmm. And so from a competition standpoint, it was challenging to have a lot of people questioning why I was doing what I was doing and whether or not I cared as much about the company as they did when it was harder for them to understand why I was doing what I was doing. And I think that, you've got lots of meetings happening where everyone's all together, and then you've got all the meetings after the meetings. And a lot of the work that I was doing was direct one-on-one with the founder and CEO of that company that other people weren't, there was no reason for them to spend time on it. And so I think that was really hard for them to understand why my work was different and the value that it was bringing when you're just in such a stressful moment-to-moment environment to begin with.
Well, and it sounds like what you describe, it feels very much like that's really a responsibility at the top to set the understanding of how everybody's role fits into the puzzle and where the alignment is. And it sounds like that was a real miss on kind of at that executive team level, is what I hear you describe.
Moving the goalpost happened a lot within that group. And so I think that that's part of the problem too, is there wasn't necessarily as much transparency on what we were doing, why, what results those were returning, but also there wasn't always enough time to see the value in something because all of a sudden what we were working on would immediately shift. Primarily what I would be working on would immediately shift. It created a really tough environment for just even confidence in, what am I doing? How am I adding value when we're not seeing these projects through to fruition.
Definitely.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying for sure, that leadership at the top wasn't working on necessarily alignment within the entire group the way that they should have been. And maybe there was less interest in cohesive team building than there should have been for having such a small team doing so many different jobs within the company.
Right. Well, and I think about even some of the research we've done on state of organizational trust and how important it is for people to understand like where their work fits, and that ability then if it's just not clear with everybody, there really is that breakdown in trust and in feeling like you're seen. So looking back at both, both of these experiences of the startup and implementing HR tech, how did working in that space ultimately shape your thinking about what actually matters to employees that's kind of bringing you more into the work you're trying to do today?
Within that particular environment, there was always a desire to kind of realign with whatever way this could possibly work. And I think that's part of that is the work of just a startup in general and finding what works and who your audience really is. But some of that was in trying to be something to everyone rather than necessarily being true to what is this intended for and how can this truly serve. And so it really opened my eyes to what do employees want? They want to be able to feel comfortable and confident when they come to work with what they're doing in their work. And then they want to go home. I think the average person, has a work life to be able to create life outside of work. And when we forget that the work is really the means to an end or an alternative, I think we really forget about how to reach the average person because we're only looking at the most work-obsessed employees. And I think there's a shift happening here as well, where we're seeing a new population emerge that has kind of seen, we had the wool pulled over our eyes. We were told a lot of things about how we show up at work is going to create a better future for us. And with the shifts in economy that we've seen and just how companies are structured and what companies are valuing, that's just not how it works anymore. And so there's a lot of distrust between employees and employers around, are you going to take care of me? Do I truly matter? Do you care about my experience? No amount of tech is going to convince employees of those things. What's going to convince employees of those things is how you show up and support them and make their day-to-day experience more enjoyable, more tolerable, more functional. And that's really what created that shift was seeing, parents are really struggling. And there's a lot of research supporting that. And there's more people now with older parents having to be that sandwich generation while they still have toddlers and not high schoolers. And so we've got people that are stretched in incredible ways on both ends, more so than we probably ever have in the past. It is really important that we create an environment that allows them to support their family and show up at work in a meaningful way.
I think, so much of everything you've said, it resonates so deeply. And I think about that research that we did and how much, when we think about the disruptions, the micro disruptions people are facing, elder care and childcare are two of the top in the personal column. And that doesn't even account for what happens in the professional column. And yet the two are constantly overlapping. And I think that's something that when you and I were getting to know each other and I learned about what you're venturing into, I was so excited because this research data shows this is absolutely needed. So let's talk about that. You've been really working on creating this workplace where childcare is a central focus because it's such a missed opportunity right now. What made you start paying attention to this issue specifically, and what's kind of excited you about what you've been seeing the opportunities so far?
I've always thought of myself as a pretty self-aware person, and I do think that I am. But until you've experienced something yourself, you really are just speculating, right? I became a parent early 2020. I was supposed to return to work during the initial shutdown, and then I had a child with medical complexities on top of that. And I really saw firsthand how terrible the system is for working mothers and working families in general. I think one specific example that I can't get out of my mind is making a referral to Mayo Clinic. We had gotten accepted to be seen there. And even after the acceptance, I had to call at 8 a.m. every single business day for 3.5 weeks to get on their schedule. And I was asking, like, do you really want me doing this? I'm so sorry that I'm calling you again. And every time it was, no, this is exactly what you need to do.
Oh my goodness.
And that was just such a disruption, even though it really didn't interrupt my workday because it was right at the beginning. It was the first thing I did before I even got settled in. It really was such a strong experience as far as showing how much parents bring with them to work every single day. And yet we're somehow just expected to switch it off. And now we're in work mode and that's all that we're thinking about. And that's really impossible. Every time my phone rang, I was concerned that my child was having an allergic reaction. And driving across town during the busiest time of the day, of course, was always such an annoyance in just operating in the day. And so thinking about how awesome would it be if I were able to be close to that child and be able to just go check on them. And I didn't have to spend all the time driving across town. It was really where it started, as well as experiencing just what it looks like to have subpar quality care and how that impacts the ability to focus at work as well. Really, the combination of those things was what made me start thinking about childcare without even really understanding that there are so many resources available to employers that make corporate childcare the logical way to solve the childcare challenges we're experiencing right now. It was so obvious that even just having scheduling align and having physical proximity was such an incredible alternative to what the average person experiences, that I started talking about it in a lot of the work that I was doing around culture and got to start having conversations with human resources professionals about, why aren't you considering this? Why have you stopped considering this? In a way that led to, what I think is a version of I can help make this a reality, getting you past that, oh, this is just too big of a project to even consider component.
So what are some of the responses you've had as you've entered into those conversations? And do you think that, certainly it's not just a benefit, right? There's so much more how organizations should be thinking about it, from this more strategic investment. So talk a little bit about some of that, like how receptive have people been? And then how is it to get them to think about this as beyond just benefits?
People are primed to have good conversations about it. I'm having good conversations all the time. If it comes up that this is what I'm building, with an employee who has gone through that stage of parenthood, they immediately want to share stories about how having access to that type of care made their life easier, or more consistently, how that would have made an incredible difference from what they experienced at that point in time. I think one of the big things that we forget about is how we show up to our employee population really impacts how they feel about us, right? And so being able to provide a tangible benefit that truly alleviates stress and brings worlds together does so much for building trust within that population and showing them that it's okay that I have kids. I don't have to be scared to disclose that about myself within this space because people care and they understand, and they understand the significance of that. It's fascinating how much talk there is about our declining population and how scary that is and what that's going to mean, while we still demonize maternity leave and women having family responsibilities within the workplace, and not really recognizing the true I don't know, craziness of
Right.
pitting those two things against one another.
I think there's a lot of that right now where we're literally saying two things that we could solve for, but we keep them very, very separate. And that's one of several examples. It feels like even when we think about it, the trust example of that, or the trust component, we could say, oh, we know trust is important. And yet the actions, exactly as you're describing, can be so very different, sometimes unintentional, sometimes maybe not, but it feels like sometimes it's so policy based that those are things we can actually control and evolve too, to bring more alignment in trust, to bring more alignment around supporting families in childcare, and it's still allowing them to be fully contributing into their unique roles without an extra worry. It just is very fascinating that it feels like it's one of those more obvious opportunities that not enough organizations are jumping on yet. And I hope that you are going to be able to break through in this.
We have an entire industry that only exists to support the world of work, and yet we've somehow convinced ourselves that it's not our problem. And I think that's fascinating. And I'm really hoping that more employers will see it as a strategic opportunity to be able to solve such specific and necessary needs for their population as well as within their community at large.
As you're building this, you're targeting companies, with you've said about 200 to 1,000 employees, really kind of in your own community as the starting point. Talk a little bit about how that's kind of coming together and why there versus jumping into larger organizations or trying where maybe there's money to be had. Talk about why you're choosing to go about it the way you are.
I think just looking at my nonprofit roots and community focus is probably the easiest place to start with it. As pretty much every incredible, functional, progressive benefit, usually those who are in very affluent companies with big names who did it for showy reasons, that's typically who has access to these innovative resources. And what I'm really hoping will happen is by focusing on communities that are really struggling with the pull to the metro or feeling deserted because of metros, that there's real value to be added to the community by serving real community needs. My speculation is that population is a little more primed to understand the severity of the situation that U.S. childcare is currently in, and to understand their role in being able to bring people into their community to solve economic challenges within their community and really solve their own challenges at the same time.
It makes sense. And it feels like something that has less red tape, more of an immediate need, and something that could maybe come to life a lot more quickly. And especially in a time when there's so much happening in the nonprofit world, and really people needing support for the ability to do their jobs well, to, balance all those different trade-offs that we talked about earlier. You talked a little bit too about some of the partnerships with some, childcare centers and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you're approaching this more in that strategic lens, and maybe the types of partners you'd hope would want to come forward and engage in conversations with you?
I think when we traditionally think about corporate childcare, we think about a benefit for employees and something that is restricted to that particular population. One of the challenges with that is that it really makes it hard to maintain a balance that's going to make a viable operational process that's sustainable for that company. Because, maybe one year you have 10 babies born and the next year you have 2. How do you maintain infant care staffing for that? The other piece is that the older the child gets, the larger the ratios get, which mean the more financially viable providing care is for them. And so the way to create a high quality center that is able to self-sustain is by creating a larger center where you have the power in numbers, both from an employee support standpoint and also from a a just population size. And so I think that opens up incredible opportunities for community partnership to be able to provide something that not just benefits an employee population, but also benefits the community in general. And so by saying, let's make sure that we serve the entire community, you have access to know that you're going to be able to fill ratios that will keep that center positively operational in a consistent manner. But you're also able to build your reputation within that community as a staple of community support. So I think there's a huge value to being able to benefit the community at large and what that does to support your reputation. But it also provides more opportunities for collaborating by saying, hey, if I do this, my partner in town, are you willing to help with this? And how are you going to show up if I bring this resource to the community? And so I think it brings a really powerful collaborative tool to these organizations to work with community organizers, economic developers, local nonprofits, other businesses that they can build alliances and more open collaboration with. And so I think it's a really powerful opportunity that a standard childcare operation really misses just because they, why would someone opening an independent childcare do those sorts of things? It also really shows an embeddedness within community support and resilience by taking that approach as well. And so I'm very excited to have conversations with people in all levels. And that's a big part of the unexpected piece that's happened in the way that I've been building the company is by being able to build relationships with economic developers who know who's wanting to come into town and what development is trying to happen and what those barriers are, along with local groups like United Way and who's really focused on serving unique populations within the community and the lens that care for that population can bring, all the way down to just, those who are passionate in committees that are focused on childcare and sustainable childcare within the community. One thing in my area that I think is pretty typical is we're seeing a lot of people who are making the decision to open a home childcare specifically because they need care for their own children and it doesn't make sense for them to stay in the workplace. The average individual who does that is only going to operate their home childcare center for 4 to 5 years. And then their kids are in school, they go back to more traditional employment, and the community loses that resource. And so investing in a more significant way here just provides so many opportunities for improvement in quality of care due to access, but also sustainable care within the community, because you're not going to shut down an operation like that 5 years later.
I love that, the focus of community, because that's something that I think we're all really wanting to tap into more and more now, and that we can see that within a community focus, we have more likelihood of making change, and whatever that is, we're all focused on. And it feels like now really is the time for something like this to take stronger roots and enable people to have something that they just aren't getting in the basis that they need for their everyday lives, especially when we think about the call for back to the office type of work and things that are so that have it. I can understand those needs, and yet they're happening without giving people the preparation they need for things like childcare and elder care. And I think what you're embarking on is going to really be right at the right time for what we all are needing. You have had such courage in telling your story today, from the lens of our Courage to Advance podcast perspective. You've really demonstrated courage in not just sharing your journey, but what you're embarking on now. So for someone listening that perhaps has experienced, their own sense of trauma or just been in an environment that feels really misaligned with their values, what would you want them to know as they listen to this, and what you might feel is really possible for them?
So I started trying to leave that company probably 2 years before it ended up actually happening. And so I think nothing happens as quick as we want it to, or especially if we're saying, hey, I'm only leaving for something that brings me forward, not just something that gets me out. And I think there's a time and a place for both of those things. And some days I think I should have just taken the way out instead of letting things get to the point where they did. But ultimately, don't let yourself get stuck and paralyzed in the incompatibility of the moment. Whatever that step is, whether it's drafting your new resume or just going to networking events and trying to talk to people or developing that idea, you deserve better than the experience that you are having right now. And every step that you take, no matter how small it is hopefully getting you toward something else that makes more sense for you. So don't get paralyzed. Keep taking those actions so that you can find something that better fits you and shares your genius in the world.
And I always think timing is everything, right? Sometimes we feel like we're behind, and maybe we're right at the exact moment when the people that are supposed to come through our lives and open new doors that's when they're opened, right? And I think we give ourselves some grace as we walk through to what's next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. And being willing to talk to people about how you're feeling and where you're at. No one can support you if they don't know what you're experiencing. And so make sure that you have those trusted people in your life that you are able to share your journey with and who can help support you in navigating that transition.
I could not agree more. So, Callie, if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about this project you're working on, learn more about Matthew's Voice, and just connect, how can they do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the easiest place to find me. I've taken a little bit of a break over the holidays, but I'm usually there all day, every day. And so finding just Callie Adamson Bakken at LinkedIn is probably the best place to start. And that'll be a good jumping off point for all things Wiggle Work and all things Matthew's Voice Project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story. I think it will resonate with many people out there.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
For our listeners, we have resources relevant to our conversation today that you can find by going to couragetoadvancepodcast.com. And remember to like and follow our podcast on your favorite platform so more leaders can benefit from these conversations. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to find them.